Stuart Hall was one of the founding figures of cultural studies. In The Fateful Triangle, drawn from lectures delivered at Harvard University in 1994, he untangles the power relations that permeate categories of race, ethnicity, and nationhood, showing how old hierarchies of human identity in Western culture were forcefully broken apart when oppressed groups introduced new meanings to the representation of difference. In this excerpt, Hall explains how globalization is reconfiguring concepts of cultural identity and ethnicity. The Fateful Triangle: Race, Ethnicity, Nation, by Stuart Hall. So why then are we witnessing the return of ethnicity, the positive reevaluation of ethnos, not only in the examples I have given, but as a worldwide phenomena? How are we to understand and narrate what is happening globally around questions of cultural identity, cultural difference, and the politics of cultural representation in these post-colonial, post-Enlightenment times, which also seem to be post-national? That is, when the Western imperial nation-state may be a thing of the past. I emphasize the conjunctural moment because its transitional and unsettling character is really what the prefix post registers for me, underlining the question of what we are coming after, what we are in the wake of, without being in any achieved sense beyond its reverberating effects, and without being able to name any new condition toward which we are definitively headed. Indeed, this ubiquitous prefix carries more than a hint that the transition may be a permanent state of affairs, transition without termination, dislocated times without the promise of supersession. Thus, post-colonial means after the epoch when imperial power was exercised by direct colonization, but it also means an era when everything still takes place in the slipstream of colonialism and hence bears the inscription of the disturbances that colonization set in motion. The term indicates a moment when everything in the conversation makes reference to the colonizing dominant, to the West, which may be resisted, but whose presence as an active force, as an interlocutor, cannot be denied, since the configurations that characterize the earlier epoch remain visible and operative, having real effects. So one might say post-colonial in the same sense that post-structuralism is the theoretical moment after a not completely superseded structuralism, which is still being referred to in the theoretical positions that post-structuralism is trying to displace. It follows too, then, that postmodernism is the time after modernism, a time that is unthinkable except as a reversal and rearticulation of the discourse of modernism, which gives us modernism in the streets, not just in the gallery. And deconstruction is the time after the grand narratives of Western metaphysics and modernity, but at a time that is unable to transcend the discursive limit points against which its own anti-foundationalism is directed. Under such circumstances, cultural identities would be another concept now placed under erasure, for precisely the embodied forms of cultural identity and difference that were constituted by the great discourses of modernity, imperial, national, racial, ethnic, masculine, ethnocentric, heterosexual, are now simultaneously decentered and reconfigured in new combinations. So how in our global times is cultural identity to be constituted and narrated? What is powerfully dislocating cultural identities at the end of the 20th century is a complex of processes and forces of change that, for convenience, can be summed up under the term globalization. By globalization, we mean the comprehensive integration of economic production, markets, financial systems, information flows, and technologies across the globe, alongside the worldwide movement of capital, goods, media messages and images and people, with the disruption of settled borders, real and symbolic as a result. Globalization refers to these intersecting processes, which increasingly cut across national frontiers, integrating and connecting nation-states, national cultures, diverse communities, and organizations into new space-time combinations that make the world, in reality and in experience, more interconnected. All of this implies the decline of the classical political idea of the sovereign nation-state, the classical economic concept of the self-regulating national economy, and the classical sociological conception of society as a sutured totality, the last of these now being displaced by a perspective that looks at how social life is ordered through overlapping and discontinuous times and space. Such space-time compressions, or disjunctures of distances and temporalities, are among the most significant features of globalization with a direct bearing on questions of identity and culture. Time and space are, after all, the basic coordinates of all systems of representation, as David Harvey has incisively demonstrated in The Condition of Postmodernity. Every medium of representation, writing, drawing, painting, photography, telecommunications, information systems, must translate its subject into spatial and temporal dimensions. Thus, literary narratives translate events into beginning, middle, end time sequences, and visual systems of representation translate three-dimensional objects into two dimensions. In his exciting book, The Black Atlantic, Paul Gilroy speaks of trying to change how we represent the story of Black music from a linear one, where African authenticity gives way to American inauthenticity, to a two-way traffic between African cultural forms and the political cultures of the diasporas. He introduces the idea of a shift from the chronotope of the road to the chronotope of the crossroads. Borrowing Bakhtin's notion of the chronotope as a unit of analysis for studying text according to the ratio and nature of temporal and spatial categories represented. An optic for reading texts as X-rays of the forces at work in the culture system from which they spring. Homi Bhabha, looking at similar questions but now in a post-colonial frame rather than a post-slavery context, defines the relations between the colonizer and the colonized in terms of disjunctive temporalities in which the colonial can only repeat itself in the colonized at a distance with a destabilizing difference through a series of dissimulating figures, with mimicry, parody, and grotesque realism being only some of the many loops through which the colonized occupy the interstice or gap in between these disjunctive temporalities so as to turn back and radically unsettle the linear time of Enlightenment modernity. Questions of memory and radical disjunctures among time signatures in Toni Morrison's Beloved function in the same way to re-narrate the experience of slavery in the African American context. The shaping and reshaping of space-time relationships within different discursive systems of representation have profound effects for how identities are narrated and understood. All identities are located in symbolic space and time. Like sexuality, they take place in the field of vision, as Jacqueline Rose suggests in her book of that name. And vision always has its spatial coordinates, real or imaginary, in a field or the overall gestalt in which the subject is perpetually placed. One might say that the mirror stage, which for Jacques Lacan is the very site of imaginary identification, is precisely such a theater of spatial speaking relations regarding such placement among the different parts of the self, and between the self and its reflection in the gaze of the other. To say that all identities are located or imagined in symbolic space and time is thus to say that we can see cultural identities as landscaped, as having an imagined place or symbolic home, a hemiot. In addition to their placings in time, in narratives of the self, in our own life stories, in invented traditions binding past and present into myths or origin that project the current moment to the archaic past, and in narratives of the nation that connect the individual to larger events on a collective scale. We need to grasp the full significance for cultural identity of the spatial relations that Edward Said called imaginary geographies. Place is one of those strong representational coordinates of cultural identity. It matters both as a dense particular local site, where many relationships have overlapped across time, producing a richly textured sense of the ways in which space is grounded by distinctive ways of life, and as a kind of symbolic guarantee of stable, continuous, cultural patterns consistently reproduced through traditions that mirror the stability of kinship and blood ties among a settled, gathered, and interrelated population. These particular coordinates of space and time are especially important for what I would call the strong version of cultural identity inscribed by the concept of ethnicity, where social activities, common worlds, and all-encompassing systems of meaning are imagined as taking place in the same real or highly specific landscape, a place fixed discursively at another level by shared blood ties of family and kinship, and thus to a certain degree perhaps by shared physical features or characteristics, where a people share not only a language or common customs, but an ethnos. Their sense of being bound to or belonging to the group is especially strong, and their version of cultural identity thereby becomes markedly confined and homogeneous as a result. Indeed, ethnicity, in this strong sense, is a form of cultural identity that, though in fact historically and culturally constructed, is powerfully tied to a sense of place and of group origins that comes to be so unified on many levels over a long period, across generations, across shared social space, and across shared histories, that it is experienced and imagined by many not as a discursive construction but as having acquired the durability of nature itself. Although discursively constructed, the strong sense of the ethnos, of a community as having been transmitted through natural inheritance, as imprinted and inherited outside what we would call the play of history and culture, as if through the natural laws of descent, points to this version of ethnicity as the discursive form in which cultural identity appears as part of kith and kin, rooted in blood and soil. Ethnicity in this strong sense helps us to imagine culture as being simultaneously at home, and as home itself, the place where we originally came from, which first stamped us with our original identity, from which there is no escape, and to which we are bonded by ties that are inherited and obligatory, the separation from which is painfully repeated in every other subsequent loss that we experience. You may recall that in my first lecture I described the discursive work that race as a sliding signifier performs in constituting a change of equivalencies that enables us to read off from the visible signs of the grosser physical differences of color, hair, and bone, those meanings that come to be fixed back down the chain, as it were, in the biological and the genetic, and that are fixed further up the chain as referred to the cultural and the civilizational. I now want to suggest that ethnicity not only functions within the same discursive chain as race, but also operates in similar ways, that is to say, as a sliding signifier. Thus, whereas race is grounded in the biological and slides toward the cultural, ethnos, or ethnicity, in the strong sense that I've just described, appears to be grounded exclusively in the cultural, in the realm of shared languages, specific customs, traditions, and beliefs. Yet it constantly slides, especially through common sense conceptions of kinship, toward a transcultural and even transcendental fix in common blood, inheritance, and ancestry, all of which gives ethnicity an originary foundation in nature that puts it beyond the reach of history. My argument here is that in addition to its many other dislocating effects, globalization powerfully fractures the temporal and spatial coordination of the systems of representation for cultural identity and imagined community that are at stake in the concept of ethnicity, with the decisive result that identity is nowadays increasingly homeless, so to speak. Anthony Giddens speaks of the separation of space from place that is affected by globalization in its late modern forms, whereas place is imagined as specific, concrete, known, and familiar, as the site of social practices that have formed and shaped our lives over long periods of time. What Giddens argues with regard to space is that in pre-modern societies, space and place largely coincided, since the spatial dimensions of social life are, for the most of the population, dominated by presence, by localized activities. The advent of modernity increasingly tears space away from place by fostering relations between absent others, locationally distant from any given situation of face-to-face interaction. In conditions of modernity, locales are thoroughly penetrated by and shaped in terms of social influences quite distant from them. It follows from this that one of the consequences of the recent forms and intensification of late modern globalization is to force us to abandon, as Doreen Massey argues, the notion of places simply as settled, enclosed, and internally coherent, and to seek instead its replacement or supplementation by a concept of place as meeting place, the location of the intersection of particular bundles of activity spaces, of connections and interrelations, of influences and movements. Such thinking underpins the view that place is the vast complexity of the interlocking and articulating nets of social relations, always formed by particular sets of social relations and by the effects which juxtaposing those interrelations produce. Despite such developments, however, globalization is not a recent phenomenon per se. We could say it was inaugurated in the moment at the end of the 15th century when Europe, having expelled its others, Jews and Muslims, turned outward, and the Euro-imperial adventure we call modernity began on a global scale. The dislocation of a world composed of settled, kin-bound, territorially unified peoples began then with exploration and conquest, colonization and slavery, as I've discussed elsewhere. The first tentative formation of a capitalist and commodity-based market economy took the form of a global rather than regional or continental phenomena, where Karl Marx famously stated, apropos the dislocating effects of this world system, all that is solid melts into the air. One might add that in its late modern incarnation, globalization has simply acquired a new intensification of this effect, which has assumed new forms. But even though capitalism and the world market long ago intersected the homogeneous cultural spaces that underpinned traditional conceptions of collective identity, it is striking to note that such versions of imagined community, in Benedict Anderson's sense, have largely remained intact until recently, since the nostalgia for community and shared culture is one of modernity's consistently compensatory and consoling refrains. There is now considerable evidence that late modern globalization as we are experiencing it is further undermining and putting into crisis those centered and unified formations of cultural identity, including that most powerful of modern identities, the nation. Such evidence of a loosening of identification with the national culture suggests that what we are witnessing is a strengthening of cultural flows and collective ties that operate above and below the level of the nation state, interpenetrating scales that disrupt our conventional distinctions of locality, neighborhood, and region. Some cultural theorists of late modernity argue that there is now an overwhelmingly powerful trend toward global interdependence that is leading to the breakdown of all strong identities, the dissolution of our older idea, or was it a fantasy, of the local produces a fragmentation of cultural codes, a multiplicity of styles mediated by current technology, an emphasis on the ephemeral, and a celebration of difference within contemporary cultural pluralism, all of which passes under the name of the global postmodern. Cultural flows within globalized consumerism, however uneven they may be, and however far they are dominated by the West, have been said to create the possibility of new kinds of transnationally shared identities, even if the process of sharing among people widely separated in space, time, and cultural conditions is mediated by the status of the participants as customers for more of the same goods, as clients for more of the same services, and as audiences for more of the same images. People in remote villages in poor third world countries can today receive in the privacy of their homes the messages and images of the rich consumer cultures of the West, which are the privileged content transmitted by global television or the ubiquitous radio, satellite, and other information systems that bind those on the former periphery into the new global networks. Jeans and sneakers, the uniform of the young in Western popular culture, are as omnipresent in Southeast Asia as in the United States or the United Kingdom, not only because they are often actually manufactured in Taiwan, Hong Kong, or South Korea for shops in London, New York, Los Angeles, Paris, or Rome, but also because of the growth of the worldwide marketing of the Western youth consumer image culture as well. It is hard under such conditions to think of Indian cooking as something expressive of the authentic ethnic traditions of the South Asian subcontinent, when there are at least 2 Indian restaurants on the main streets of every town and city in Britain. In London's East End, Tower Hamlets, or the Isle of Dogs, for instance, going for a curry is the favorite way for National Front skinheads to warm up before an evening's entertainment of beating up Bangladeshi youths. The combination is now as English as a cup of tea. Yet for all of these examples of the global postmodern, cultural homogenization is the fast-growing orthodox narrative of globalization as a transitional strategy, since there is a distinct power geometry to it, it being easier to eat ethnic in Los Angeles than it is in Calcutta. This is a narrative that I observe to be particularly seductive for critical intellectuals in the West. There is no doubt a great deal of truth in it. All the same, it is in my view a one-sided account of cultural exploitation, a tale with which to frighten little children. Let me try to say quietly what I believe is wrong with this way of conceptualizing the effects of globalization, and what is wrong by extension with the equally homogenizing and essentializing conception of ethnicity, which, by its absent presence in the discourse of lament, underpins the narrative of cultural homogeneity as its mirror opposite. One objects to this thesis first because the most striking aspect of the newer forms of globalization is the appearance, alongside the tendencies toward homogenization, of the proliferation of difference of all sorts. Only some of these developments are effectively harnessed to the global market, which in any event moves and responds as much by exploiting diasporas as by regulating them. It uses forms of niche marketing in which tapping into marginal advantages produces fluctuating effects of which capital is only in partial control. What the cultural homogenization narrative loses sight of is that the march of global capital is accompanied by the unexpected revival and return of new kinds of local identifications, new forms of symbolic attachments to the connotations of place and cultural specificity, and new discursive formations of the traditional, even in matters of taste and style that span the vast distances integrated by the new global technologies and which link together the various times and spaces of capital turnover and production. There has emerged a new symbolic tribalism, as Alberto Melucci calls it, alongside the consumer homogenization story of Coca-Cola, Big Macs, Nike sneakers, and CNN broadcasts everywhere. What else is street style or street cred, or the symbolic global significance of place names such as Bed-Stuy, Brixton, or Trenchtown, as they circulate in the New World musics of rap and reggae, if not a marking of locality, with its connotations of place as a response to the forces of homogenization? We see other such cases of an emphasis on the local in forms of popular culture in Japan and Southeast Asia. There is a difference, of course, between the forms of difference that are harnessed to and permeated by the capitalist market and other forms of marking cultural difference that represent fissures, breaks, or fault lines in the cultural system that the market has to negotiate. The fact that there is negotiation means we are not dealing with absolute difference, But where would you draw the line in rap or reggae between differences permeated by the market and differences that signify social ruptures? Certainly, these new localisms that emerge with the proliferation of difference are not simply a repetition of the primordial and homogenizing attachments that place names may have been taken to signify in the past. Instead, they function, as Kevin Robbins argues, as a new kind of local that acquires specific meaning by operating within a larger, globalized cultural topos. Such localisms as Bed-Stuy indicate the movement of a reconfiguration of ethnicity, marking looser, more porous, more open-ended, and increasingly hybridized forms of cultural identity, which are thus the site not of the unilateralist triumph of the global postmodern, but of something more difficult, complex, and historically specific, namely, new articulations between the local and the global that cannot be mapped within the terms of nations and national cultures as we might have tried to do in the past. The proliferation of such cultural differentiations confronts us with articulations of differences and similarities that no longer cohere within a singular cultural, discursive, or political framework. These new forms of articulation of the local and the global cannot be convened, as it were, under the roof of a single identity, all overlapping in the same place. The prolific spread of such cultural differentiations produces something more diverse, more fragmented, more discontinuous, a less sutured than anything that has come before, giving rise to often contradictory articulations across spaces, times, and discourses that produce complex points of cultural identification, positionalities that tend to dislocate rather than reprise one another. Nevertheless, such developments and tendencies are critical for our story, since this is how difference is more and more actually being produced and negotiated in the world. It is precisely from such hybridized and incomplete foci of difference that many new identifications are arising. The production of new points of identification, as well as the return to and revival of old ones, which I shall come back to in a moment, is thus an all-important key to the emergence of what we may call the reconfiguration of ethnicity under the conditions of the global postmodern. A second objection to the cultural homogenization narrative stems from the way the story, with its built-in oscillation between the binary poles of tradition and modernity, not to speak of Antonio Gramsci's old friend's pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, recapitulates and repeats the assumptions of the Enlightenment grand narrative. Liberalism and Marxism, which were both in their different ways Enlightenment grand narratives, in that they sought to tell stories of human progress, led us to expect that those old ties and bonds of symbolic attachment to place, tribe, locality, religion, and landscape would be gradually but remorselessly swept aside by the advance of capitalist modernity, commodifying, rationalizing, and thereby homogenizing everything in its wake. Marxism's logic of capital and liberalism's drive toward secularization and universalism are, in this sense at least, not antithetical but mirror discourses of each other. But in my view, the ways that liberalism and Marxism alike tell the story of modernity are one-sided and incomplete. Capitalist modernity has always advanced as much by way of the production and negotiation of difference as it has through enforcing sameness, standardization, and homogenization. Those who know capitalist modernity at the periphery always know that in Latin America and Africa, with their dependent economies of the interior and their neo-colonial or export sectors integrated into the world market unevenly, it is the exploitation of difference, the taking advantage of differentials, and not the standardization of economic variables, that pushes the story of capitalist modernity remorselessly onward. This applies equally to the combination of tribal homelands, migrant labor camps, and segregated residence in South Africa until recently, and was indeed an underpinning to the New World slavery itself in the Americas and the Caribbean, where unfree and forced labor exist in a different relationship that is foundational to the so-called free market of the global capitalist economy. What we see at both the periphery and the center of the system is that differences have been gendered, sexualized, and classed, as well as being ethnicized and racialized as a condition of the functioning of the world market. One sometimes suspects that in the face of such complexities of articulation in both past and present configurations of Western modernity, there is a degree of collusion among the various identities connected by trade and so on. It is true that globalization, whether early modern or late modern, is a combined and uneven process with dramatically differential effects in different places and in different strata. Both the corporate executive in his business class seat aboard a jumbo jet flying from Jeddah to Tokyo, and the Arab desert traveler on his camel moving between oases, over which the former unwittingly passes, are postmodern nomads in the sense that each occupies very distinct time-space trajectories. Nevertheless, the fact is that ever since the onset of the Euro-imperial adventure, global times and spaces have never peacefully coexisted, but have been brutally truncated and condensed into one overarching, dominant, abstract, and imperial chronotope, which is the time of the West. The societies of the periphery have never been the closed hinterlands they have been represented to be, for they have always been open to Western cultural influences and vice versa. The idea that the colonial peripheries are closed spaces, ethnically pure, culturally traditional, and forever undisturbed, in what Claude Lévi-Strauss called the old zones of history until yesterday, is merely a fantasy about otherness, a colonial fantasy maintained about the periphery by the West, which tends to like its natives pure, its beaches empty, and its exotic places to be far away and untouched by human hands. Another consequential effect of staging the process of globalization in terms of a static opposition between two essentialized objects of discourse, their backwardness and our globally modern advancement, is the way in which such an approach tends to construe the symbolic reconfiguration of ethnicity today as necessarily a form of fundamentalism, a refusal of modernity, which makes it by definition regressive, archaic, and atavistic. I will come back to this way of thinking about the return to ethnicity when I discuss the category of nation in my third lecture. Nevertheless, in the extent that such a binary between backward and advanced is embedded in common sense discourses of tradition and modernity, one would hardly believe that the new forms of cultural identity and identification arising with the current forms of globalization have also been profoundly important sites of resistance. The last point brings me to a third objection to the globalization homogenization narrative, that this narrative not only is unable to countenance a politics of resistance, but also cannot account for the production of new identities as they arise under late modern conditions. One has only to think of the role played in national liberation and decolonization struggles by the idea of a people and a culture that predate colonialism, however much it functioned as a foundational myth, a necessary fiction, or the role that the symbolic recall of Africa played in the re-narrativization of history that led in the 1960s and 1970s to the civil rights movement in the United States and the Cultural Revolution that transformed the British West Indies into a black space for the first time since slavery. To realize that what 20th century history confronts us with is the production of new subjects and not the mere repetition of old ones, as a way of understanding that what is at issue in the return of ethnicity today is the production of identities and identifications rather than the uncovering of essences given in nature. One might equally recall how an idea of Africa, not a place actually located on any map, but a country of the mind, alone enabled young children of Caribbean migrants, the second generation, to survive life in the United Kingdom in the 1970s. It was cultural forms such as the music technology of the recording studio, the sound system, and the vinyl disc, as much as the metaphorical languages of Rastafarianism, that allowed them not just to survive, but also to acquire the sense of self-pride, the symbolic centeredness, and their own way of styling their bodies that characterized their new ways of being, or rather becoming, Black in the post-war history of multicultural Britain. The view that any of these highly complex and variable forms of new ethnicity, whether in African America, Black Britain, or the Caribbean, could be understood, deciphered, or explained away as simply a return to Blackwardness is simply laughable. One could much more easily and convincingly make the case that what one sees in such phenomena is precisely the doubling, the Janus face, of ethnicity in global times, which compels our attention toward the discursive effects of doubleness, reversal, and transcoding that are its characteristic symbolic and cultural features. Above all, what such new ethnicities confront us with is the symbolic detour to the present that moves through the past, marking the site of collective investment in stakes made on the future within these difficult, more vernacular experiences of modernity.